Hi, Bernhard. Welcome
Bernhard.
to this dialogue. In a moment, I'll invite you to introduce yourself, but we're here to explore integral spirituality and, in particular, what are the enabling structures and structured interactions that are needed so that the principles of integral spirituality can be expressed with ease. And in particular, what we're saying is that if you're trying to express some principle, put it into action, the best case is that the things that you would do to express that are the natural, easy things that the structures and the structures interactions are designed to enable, rather than, as is so often the case, when you try to act according to your principles or your values, you're often doing so against the structures that we're currently embedded in. So perhaps, Bernhard, if you want to say a few words to introduce yourself and then pose one of the principles or concepts in integral spirituality that suggest different kinds of structures to the ones we typically use today.
Yeah, thank you, Graham. So Bernhard Possard, I'm living, working in Austria, mainly as a consultant for organizations, family for children. So my one of the principles that has become very important to me is how can what we're talking about fit to how we are doing it. And also, how can we become more aware about how the structures and the processes, or the right bottom quadrant, if you want, how this is shaping the outcome. So, for example, together with others, I'm kind of herding or hosting, etc., a platform for integral Christianity in the German-speaking world. And I think it was clear from the very beginning that we would try to find processes that are fitting to the content, that are fitting to the mental space of the people that we are cohering. So, of course, we have no top-down decisions. We have not even a legal structure at the moment because we do not necessarily need to have one at the moment, but rather we have some kind of sociocratic self-organizing space that at the same time is enabling clarity. So that's just a very simple example. But of course, it would be really weird if we would kind of exchange around integral spirituality and how we become empowered, how we identify more with the whole. And then we have old decision-making structures, for example. So, and I think we all know the Jesus quote about the new wine and the old wineskins. So probably that's also something to be aware of. So if we have new wine, or if we realize that we need new wine, how can we also make sure that the wineskins are fitting? Check.
Yes, excellent. That resonates superbly with me, Bernhard. And in particular, I think that some of the things that struck me in what you were saying, absolutely that saying of you shouldn't put new wine in old wineskins is very, very relevant here. Except perhaps if you're making single malt Scottish whiskey, because then you do put that into old port barrels, because that's part of what makes malt whiskey what it is. So part of what I'm hearing is that nothing that we're talking about is necessarily the absolute right answer in every situation, always, everywhere. But it's very much context dependent. And perhaps this is one of the challenges for people who are trying to put spiritual principles into practice. There's a lot of very rigid thinking that says this is the right answer, always, everywhere, for everyone, just as that was illustrated with, well, you wouldn't put new wine into old wineskins but you would put new malt whiskey into old port barrels. And the part of where I'm seeing that show up, as you were saying, in this integral Christianity exploration in the German speaking world, you've recognized that this isn't a place where you can turn to a higher authority for the right answer. Rather, this is a process of exploration that everybody is going through. Each person may end up finding answers that are useful to them in their context that are different to the answers useful to their neighbor living 10 kilometers away. And so instead of having a hierarchical structure, you're doing it with a very flat sociocratic structure on a journey of exploration. And I'm assuming from there that you may have at one point a certain person is leading the group, but they are not the leader. They just happen to be pulling the group forwards at that point. Somebody else may do that same role 5 minutes later. And this is where, as you said, you're not incorporated. If you were incorporated, just the rigid legal requirements for an incorporated entity may even prevent you from doing some of the things that you need to do. And so this is where I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we have at the moment, that we're all embedded in the existing legal structures that reflect principles or paradigms of ownership rather than the kinds of agency-based paradigms that need to be in place to fully express what you're trying to do. So I'll say check at that point, and I'm curious what thoughts that awakens in you. Check.
Probably if I hear you repeating what I said about not having hierarchy, one could hear some kind of greenish, basis democratic, talking in circles, which I do not think that we are having. So there are processes in place that enable decision clarity, so that enable that the system becomes aware of itself, sees itself and the connections with the outside, and enables some kind of, I'm not sure if alignment is a positive word, but some kind of being in sync with what is happening around while staying true to itself. So that the formula that I'm using again and again, also in my consultancy, but I think it's true for all kinds of transformations, is we can only stay who we are if we change how we are. So in German, you would say, wir bleiben dasselbe, wenn wir nicht die Gleichen bleiben. So and I'm not sure, maybe you could find a better translation for that. But I think this is important that the concept of transforming ourselves again and again while staying true to our essence, I think it's important that this is already baked into the DNA of the system from the very beginning. And maybe the last point, if we want, we could see, for example, the Catholic Church as being the most traditional system that we're having on the planet, the most traditional human-made system. At the same time, we could see exactly the same church as being the most transformative system that is on the planet, but because it's a master of integrating all kinds of DNA from other social structures, and also of letting go all kinds of DNA and putting it into the museum. And of course, it is doing this on a pace that makes a lot of us very impatient, including myself. But at the same time, if we look at it from a bit more afar, it's incredible how it is in digesting and incorporating and letting go all kinds of material that has not been there 2000 years ago. Check.
Yes, yes, excellent. That intrigues me, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But first, I'd like to pick up on where you started, which is that what you were saying could have sounded spiral greenish, that everything just goes round in circles seeking consensus and nothing happens until everybody agrees. This is for me, one of the critical challenges that we face, which is at the moment, most of the business world sees either that kind of way of leading and running organizations, consensus based, everything goes round in circles. It happens very, very slowly because you don't do anything until everybody agrees. Or you have a much more hierarchical management accountability hierarchy, dictatorial leadership, where you can get quick decisions taken, but those decisions are limited by the capacity of the leader to see everything sufficiently clearly, to have the cognitive capacity to grasp everything that they need to grasp, and who they are is able to deal with that. So, what I'm hearing you say is that you're running it in a way, the way that you structure the interactions. And I think this is important to notice that what you were describing there were structured interactions, not just arbitrary people do what they want, but everybody is interacting in a very specific, structured way designed to lead to decision making that is effective decision making, most important, and fast decision making, second most important, where you can come to a wise enough decision to proceed as fast as possible to achieve that wise decision. And this is essential in the business world. We have to have that. And my sense is that this is one of the big things that is missing in the business world is this way of transcending and including the combination of the benefits of a consensus structured interaction where you can bring in all of the different perspectives and cognitive capacity of a large group of people with the benefits of speed of a hierarchical decision-making process. And so I'm curious what you might say to that. But before I give back to you, I'm intrigued with what you are bringing in around the Catholic Church as being the most traditional human structure on the planet, and yet at the same time, one of the most effective in history at self-transformation whilst remaining true to its essence. And I'd also appreciate it if you could unpack some examples of what you're seeing in that, both the downside of its speed and the positive side, and perhaps through that to unpack what you said in the middle, which I think is very, very important. The the necessity to stay true to our essence, and that staying true to our essence requires continuous self-transformation. And I'll put in my words here, because the context that we're in and our relatedness to other people and that context, that relatedness is constantly changing. So we can't continue to perfectly express our essence if we don't change ourselves.
Let me start with the idea of essence. Mm, We have a house with a well. There's an own well coming where the water comes from. And so it's the same well since more than 200 years for this house. At the same time, it's not the same water, of course, because the water is fresh every minute. So it's no longer the same water. And even the well is no longer the same structure because every, I don't know, 40 years, you need to kind of re-establish the structure to kind of catch the water, how it comes out of the, the soil or the rocks. So is it still the same well? Yes and no. And the metaphor for me highlights the critical process not only of integrating and letting go, but also of again and again feeling, touching, seeking the essence again and finding new words and new metaphors for what the essence is, while trying to stay close to the essence. But the essence is not the word. So the Tao that can be spoken is not the Tao, but there is a Tao. And it could well be that in, I don't know, 100 years maybe even, many people would no longer use the term Christ as a term for a spiritual reality that is there. Maybe you would say an actuality at least, but it's something that is a presence, that is not just a concept, but a presence of that people, including myself, experience. But at the same time, it might well be that we no longer would use the term Christ, but the essence is still there. And we might call it energy, and we call it, I don't know, what was the term of the Yiddish? Um, the power be with you, etc. So it's
Yes.
whatever the term it is, but the essence is not the term. And
Mm.
it's necessary to also keep digging for the well and keep refreshing the well itself. The second would be about speed. So just to make sure that we understand how Christianity became not another Jewish sect, because at the time there were different Jewish sects. And you remember that when the apostles came together, including Paul, who had never really seen Jesus, there was a lot of discussion, and then they made a decision that you could become a follower of Christ or of Jesus, probably, without having to circumcise. So if you wanted to become a Jew then, and I'm not sure if it's maybe true today as well, but at least back then, if you wanted to become a Jew, you had to become circumcised, even as an adult man. But they decided that they could make people and they could baptize people to become followers of Christ and not being circumcised. So this was a huge decision that had a lot of effects. They also made, of course, the decision even before that they were not only going to Jewish people, but to the whole world. And they were traveling to Greece, they were traveling to Turkey, to Rome, and maybe even farther. So they were incorporating these new ideas and letting go of circumcision, for example. They put it into what I call the museum. And so again and again, this was happening. So they were incorporating a lot of Hellenistic thoughts, including that Gospels were written in Greek and not in Aramaic, the language that Jesus spoke, probably. They were incorporating a lot of ideas from the Roman tradition, including buildings and other terms. They were including a lot of concepts of the Roman legal system, etc., etc. So there's so much material there. And this the strange thing probably is that until the Renaissance, the church was at the forefront of development, if you want. But apparently then something happened, and where with maybe you could say that they were not able to integrate well what Luther and the other Reformists were doing. So if they would have done that, they would have been quicker in adopting and adapting to the modern world. And so now, at least in the Catholic Church, we have so much blue elements, so patriarchic, hierarchical, etc. thinking that is so much out of touch with the Western world that you would say it's horrible how slow the church is, Catholic. But of course, this also says a lot about our Western-centric perspective. Because if you look at a lot of other countries, um, a lot of what the church is saying is too modernist. So this, and if we see how where the millions and billions of Christians live at the moment, and on which um, worldview probably they adhere to, then you could say this is very integral. If integral means speaking the language and following the structures where your people are. So you see how I'm trying to reframe what it means also to be integral. So you could see integral as that's the stage after green, after postmodern. Then comes integral. But if you see integral as speaking the language, following the structures and processes and metaphors, etc., of my people, then it could well be that you are speaking a mixture of blue and orange, and this is the way how integral looks like in this context.
That really resonates with me, what you've just been saying. The the history of the church and how Christianity didn't become another Jewish sect, but rather went down a different path. And what I was hearing in that is a very deliberate choice that some of the, let's say, some of the structured patterns of interaction changed from one circumcision to another baptism. And that was one that was much more enabling for people to join. And so it enabled the church to grow, to reach places, to reach people that it would not otherwise have been able to reach. The essence kept the same, but the structures, the structured interactions that were expressing that essence changed. And it was that that made all the difference. You know, along with what you were saying, that they, instead of writing the gospel in Aramaic, they wrote it in Greek. They brought in all of the aspects from the Roman context, the Roman culture, the Roman law, again, which enabled it to go beyond what would have been possible as another Jewish sect into something completely different. So that intrigues me. And I think it does point at what you ended with, that integral spirituality ought to be thought of as something that is enabling for all of the different levels or colors in the spiral framework, rather than something that is aspires to only achieve the highest level and everything else is in some sense denigrated. It's not quite there yet. It's not quite good enough, but rather it's something that embraces all. And the bit that you pointed at, which I think is very true, it's very easy to build structures, structured interactions and culture for only one narrowly defined group of people with a narrowly defined belief system, because then you can easily have structures that are perfectly optimized for that belief system. You know, for example, if you believe that pure competition is the way to solve everything, it's easy to build structures that do that. However, if pure competition is not a way of solving all problems in the marketplace, then those structures will be toxic, will be completely dysfunctional for specifically those problems that need collaboration rather than pure competition. And that really is a huge challenge, because the problems that we're dealing with today are not problems that can be solved by one single cookie cutter set of solutions. They're much too broad, much too diverse. They're changing much too rapidly. They're very much more in the sense, and part of what that rapid change means is what you were pointing at with the Catholic Church. And maybe there's a lot more that we can learn from that. Maybe this is a topic for a follow-up conversation, in the sense that if you want to engage in expressing integral spirituality, you need to have structures and structured interactions where all of the spiral colors have a home. All of the spiral colors are explicitly welcomed and engaged with, and they feel welcomed and engaged with, which is very difficult because if you think of, as you said, spiral blue, that's bureaucratic. That requires everybody to follow exactly the same bureaucratic patterns versus, for example, a spiral orange, which is all about individuality and achievement and forging your own path. And so there's a big challenge in bringing those two together into one home, one set of structures and structured interactions. So if now's a good time for us to move towards wrapping up for you, perhaps that would be a good place for you to put in a couple of thoughts on what thoughts does that catalyze in your mind?
So my short version, short form for integral sometimes is it's a point. Sorry, it's a vector, not a point. So it's a developmental vector, and at the same time, so it means hopefully that we are enabling spaces where people, on the one hand, feel at home, while at the same time feel the free invitation to develop if they want in their pace. And so I've been talking about a platform that we are cohering around integral Christianity in the German-speaking world. But then we realized it's not enough. So there are people that are connecting, but they are not, in the end, interested in a lot of reflection around integral theory and all these kind of special things, and they're in their maturity maybe not fully yet willing and maybe able to jump into self-organizing spaces. But they, on the other hand, they already feel that they need something more, something different that they would find in their parish. And so we created another space. We call it CoNet, a Christian open network for lively or live spirituality. And while we try to keep these two spaces distinct, we are enabling transitions. So it's okay to be in CoNet and stay there. It's okay to be in the platform and stay there. It's okay to transition from A to B or from B to A. And at the same time, we have other linkages to other spaces that may fit better for the demands or preference or type or whatever of the people. So I think that's important that that it's a free space and not a kind of a one fits all, that you say. The other thing I think is one thing that we can learn, I think, from integral spirituality, from the integral theory, is that we try to see not one quadrant as being absolute. So I think a quote that you were using before is spirituality is love in action. And if I like the right quadrants more, so the quadrants where it's about doing things or structuring things, if I hear with this ear, with the right quadrant ears, the love in action, I would say, yes, we have to do things. they need to take responsibility and projects and social welfare or whatever it is, or all kinds of communities and praying circles, etc. And this is not false, that's true, but it's not complete. Uh, and um, and as you said, I think also in the left quadrant, so where it's about my personal or individual consciousness and also collective relationships, traditions, culture, this is also some kind of action. And I think Christian spirituality would not be complete if we would not have also this going inside and finding Christ, if you want, as an internal actuality, and also not being alone in my cabin and praying to God and hoping that God will, I don't know, do something with me, but rather that I feel the ties with other people and identifying with others and enlarging my scope of identification so that when I say I, the I no longer is the me, but rather the I becomes a bigger we and the we becomes bigger until humanity, the biosphere, the planet becomes the we. And as some theologians say, that I can feel identified with the cosmos as being the body of Christ.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense to me, what you're saying, Bernhard. And in particular, the two things that really stood out there was your recognition that you needed two types of ways of structuring the people, bringing them into relationship with each other, because it wasn't possible to meet everybody's needs with just one structure. And I think this is something that is really important if we look now at what are we doing when we earn our money, when we do our work in the world, that we, even within a single company, it may be necessary to have multiple parts of that company that are structured quite differently, where there's the flexibility and freedom to move from one part to another, so that people people are in structures and structured relationships that really enable them to express their essence, their principles, their values through the work that they're doing. And that fits very well with what you were saying at the end, in that, yes, spirituality can be defined as love in action, but then the shadow side is if you get so enamored of the action that you end up on a treadmill just acting, 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 which in many senses would almost certainly lead to losing contact with the actual spiritual values themselves. And so your actions may end up being harmful rather than helpful, which is the exact opposite of what you wanted. And that's why it needs to be very much integral across all four quadrants so that everything fits together in a holistic way. And I'd put in one last thought, which is to connect it with what you were saying earlier, that to stay true to your essence, you need to be constantly transforming yourself. And this is the one of the, let's say, challenges, which is immediately you start to do something to express a spiritual principle, you're at risk through doing it to become too focused on the doing and not on the integration between the doing and the principle. And then as the context changes, you might end up doing something that is no longer aligned with the principle. And that, again, I'd connect that with business, much as modern business has raised the standard of living of so many people to a point where a few billion people have a standard of living that a couple of hundred years ago, not even kings and queens could hope to have that standard of living. You know, it took a very high level member of royalty to have hot water whenever they wanted it. That was not common. So we've done a superb job of that with the structures that we have shaped over the past century. But those structures are now holding us back from where we need to go in the next decades. So again, that's an illustration of we've become so enamored of the doing, we've lost contact with the reason why we were doing that doing. And we need to stay true to our essence. We need to transform our doing in order to stay true to our essence, which also means we need to transform in many senses who we are, our identity, all of those things. So, Bernhard, this has been a very good conversation up to now. I suspect this is a good time to press pause and to reconnect at some later date and continue the exploration. Check.
Thank you, Graham, for these wonderful conversations. How can we stay a seed and while becoming wheat? And so, as Jesus said, the seed needs to die so that it become the new wheat. And so this is, I think, one of the wonderful metaphors of transformation. Thank you so much, Graham. Blessings.
Wonderful. Thank you very much as well, Bernhard. This has been for me a very inspiring and inspiring and wide-ranging conversation that I've enjoyed. And I really like what you've ended with. The seed needs to die to become wheat. And the consequence of that is then a large number of other seeds that in their turn at a later stage will have to die to become wheat. Check. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Bernhard.